and good morning and happy Saturday again. This is episode 3 of the Hotel Havoc podcast. My name is, I go by Havoc6 as my call sign, as many of you already know, but you can call me Ian, that also works. And a little bit about me for those who have never joined the podcast previously. I am an Army captain. I've been a combat engineer officer for over 10 years, just about going on 15 now. And I spent a lot of time in different jobs, different roles within the defense community in DC, a little bit of foreign military sales, a little analyst work, strategic analyst work here and there. So I know a little about a lot of things, and I'm no expert, no SME, but I like to bring on people who are way smarter than me to come and talk about why they're smarter than me. And with that, I want to take a minute to introduce my guest here. One you may be familiar with if you've been interested in tracking weapons, systems, information in general regarding conflicts around the world. And I'm joined today by Calibre Obscura, which I'll now call you Cali from here on, if that works. How you doing today, man?
Yeah, pretty good, thank you. It's a nice day outside.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's got to be somewhat rare for the UK, right?
Not as rare as you'd think at this time of year. I'll leave it like that.
No, that makes sense. So this is usually the time of year that I used to travel. I used to go to Ireland every year. So every spring or maybe late summer, we go to Ireland, and the weather is usually pretty solid. And always enjoyed those trips.
Yeah, I think when it gets like above 30 degrees, that's sort of not so common, but. Yeah, sure. Now it's about right. And this is the most British thing ever. Like you start off and it's like we start talking about the weather. My apologies. Proceed.
No, I know. I had to do it. I had to roll with it. It's the way. So my folks, my parents are from Ireland, and I have a lot of family that are from the UK as well. So it's normal. It's what I'm used to. But again, man, hey, I appreciate you joining. I want to just talk a little bit about anyone who's maybe not familiar with you, but your self-described bio, basically, you told us that you're interested in arms research and analysis, and you're an occasional effort poster, which I need to ask what an effort poster is, because I don't think I know that one.
Well, everyone talks about shit posting. The opposite of shit posting in my mind is effort posting. So, like, I occasionally put effort into the posts.
That's fair. I actually like that. I might have to categorize some of the stuff I post so people are aware. I don't know if you've seen lately, but I've been ranting that sarcasm does not carry well in Twitter. It's really, really bad. So I might have to put like a little note that this is an effort post or this is a shit post.
Yeah, it really doesn't, and particularly when you're dealing with people that maybe don't know you very well or haven't followed you for a long time. Like people that know my work and know my opinions will be fully aware that like a full 80% of what I say is probably sarcastic or tinged with sarcasm. Not everyone does. That's the way of text, isn't it? Yeah.
That's the way you got to do it, man. That's how you got to do. So some of the stuff that you've been kind of interested in focusing on has been like the Middle East, Asia, some Africa work, and of course, Ukraine. You also mentioned that you're self-taught and anti-authoritarian, which is obviously a great thing, right? But beyond that, like, tell me a little bit more about yourself. What kind of got you interested in all of this? Where'd you start? I know you've been around since at least 2017 on this current profile I have here. But yeah, just give me a little bit more background about you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like many other terrible things, it kind of started on Reddit. I was looking on Reddit, and I've said this before, but I was looking on Reddit, like combat footage or Syrian civil war or something like that. And I was looking at that. And I had time to burn, and I really wanted to be distracted. And I was like, I'm not seeing the content that I want to read. That's not to say there wasn't lots of people doing great work to a certain extent. I just wasn't aware of that. But I didn't see the stuff that I wanted to see. There was a lot of really talented people, even on places like that. So, Hugo, the world's best vehicle-borne explosive device, I'm butchering it, expert, VBIED, he started off posting on Reddit first. So it's not to say, not to disparage anything there, but I saw a gap in what I wanted to read, which was, on the one side, you've got very, very dry, analytical, hard to get into, stodgy PDFs. And on the other side, you've got people just posting on social media. Now, I'm really trying to post much less. It's got a lot worse, but social media in general. But there's a gap between the two. And what I wanted to do was get just into writing for people a bit like me who wanted to kind of learn things in a more narrative format. The approach that I take with particularly my public writing is I always try and find the more esoteric, I try and find the more interesting, and I try and find the narrative out of all these things. Now, if we're discussing weapons in general, yeah, I mean, I'm obviously from the UK. It's a bit unusual, but in a sense, I steeped myself via the internet in what you could call American gun culture for a long, long time. I can't tell you exactly how long, but, you know, all of these blogs, forums, enthusiasts, areas, I was just really interested in that. It ticked my boxes for some reason. And yeah, it kind of moved on from there. I'm trying to avoid erming, but it moved on from there. I started writing, and then I found, look, there's much, 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 much more here. You've got to learn so much more about the subject matter. Every day I learn more. Every day I realize how little I know. And over time, I just became interested in, I remember the Libyan civil war starting after the Libyan revolution, and Syria, and all of those associated events, the rise of the Islamic State, and the subsequent semi-collapse of the Islamic State, and now obviously Ukraine. So I hate to be a terminal generalist, but I'm just interested in all the weapon systems they're using, small to large scale, and I'm also just really interested in some of the dynamics of how some of these groups operate, both whether state or non-state, messaging, media, operations, all of these things. Now, you know, to be clear, I'm not from a military background. I left school without a university degree. I don't have anything, I left school at 18. I work a very different job to this, which I enjoy, but this is not my day job. And yeah, there we are. I'm ranting. My apologies.
No, that's perfect. No, but that's 100% fair. Hell, man, how many like you pointed out accurately, how many keyboard warriors and experts are out there right now? We went from Ukraine offensive experts to the ZPP, the power plant experts, to now the French riot experts. But I will say that I've been following you for a while now, actually, and I appreciate your approach to things. It's just straight up, here's a weapon system. It's interesting that it's in Ukraine. It's interesting that it's in Syria. And your blog at calibreobscura.com is the same way. I appreciate it. It's very, from what I've seen, it seems well written, and it doesn't, you don't speculate. You don't say anything that you wouldn't know, right? I mean, that's half the battle, and that's a good lesson others could learn, I suppose.
One of the main goals was with that writing was, look, hey, when it becomes less interesting, I'll stop doing it. I stopped writing for probably nigh on 2 years, then start again. I'm not writing much at the moment. But the most important thing was with that I wanted to just put out as much accurate information as I possibly could. I have biases. We all have biases. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat that. But yeah, one thing I'm not going to do is make things up or hype for the sake of nothing. And yeah, you touched on it, and I was listening to Robert Evans, as of Behind the Bastards fame, talking about it just the other day, about it makes it so easy for anyone to put a thought out there. That's a good thing, but the downside of that is you get social media analysts which don't accurately reflect the situation, if I can put that diplomatically. Yeah, sorry.
Yep. No, that's honestly nicer than I would have put it. I think you nailed that. I am the first to admit, most of us come from a biased background. I'm obviously biased when it comes to the Ukraine situation. I'm very upfront about that. I don't hide that. Try to maintain an open mind. That's all we can do, and just approach it from that perspective. But a little off topic before we dive in, because I have to decide how combative I want this to be. Who's your team? Premier League? Do you follow the English Premier League? Yep.
Yes, I'm sorry. I didn't catch the last bit. Manchester United.
Yeah. Yes, there's my man. Hell yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah.
Born and raised Man U fan since I can walk. So I just had to clarify before I got too far.
Yeah, people, it's really important to so many people. And, I'm not going to say I'm a huge football guy, but when there was the World Cup, when there's big stuff going on, I'm interested. And yeah, it comes from, it's just always been a tradition, I would say, since day dot. I don't quite know why. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, no, I'm the same way. I played for years, but I obviously gravitated a little bit more to focusing on news and boring stuff, but I always have to ask because my very first trip to the UK was a Man U and Leeds game, and no, Man U Liverpool game. Yeah, it was great.
Brilliant.
I learned a lot of swear words as a 7-year-old. I can tell you that much. But anyway, I just had to segue real quick to, like I said, to see how combative I wanted to be for the rest of this. So, but with that, let me just dive in a little bit here. I know you obviously have a lot of interest in a lot of, like I said, I enjoy reading your blog, but I kind of wanted to narrow it a little bit to get your thoughts on some things. So it's impossible to talk about any current events right now in the defense or arms weaponry world without bringing up Ukraine, obviously due to its magnitude and the significance of a major land war in Europe. And I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts, because we had talked about this previously. I wanted to hear your thoughts on how news media is approaching the war across the world. It's from my perspective, and I'm sure everyone else's, it's very uneven. It's extreme one way or the other. And I just want to pose that question, that very broad question, to you, and then we can kind of narrow it from there. But yeah, just want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I try and do is I try not to just bash people, and I try not to, as we'd say, gas people up too much either. So I'll take that approach. So what I think is good about how I'm going to talk about Western media in particular in this sense, how they have approached Ukraine, is there has been a shift from, we've got this vague, uncertain rebellion from people who speak a different language to the rest of Ukraine, and maybe they're oppressed, and maybe they do have a point. And can we really be sure that the Russians are involved? I wasn't intensely following it in 2014, 2015, but you can read reporting from then. I've read a lot of reporting from then to try and understand some of the more background here. And I'm not an area expert, so I'm going to put that out. But you did have a lot of that, and Ukrainians complain about that. Now, if I can say one other thing is, I'm not Ukrainian. Ideally, if we were talking about this, we'd have a Ukrainian here to bring the local perspective. I obviously don't agree with that, with the ideas that you've been to that on the ground, you can't ever say anything, yada, yada, yada. I think that's a step too far. But, this is from a Western perspective. Ideally speaking, I would like to try and center a Ukrainian perspective, or even as controversial as it may be, if we were talking about what Russian soldiers are experiencing, that Russian perspective. Because we are dealing with people that this is their lives on the line. This is their value systems. Segueing from that, I think one of the things which the Western media hasn't done so well is actually taking into account the existential nature of what this is for Ukraine and the Ukrainian state. There was this assumption that the Ukrainian military would collapse. I personally didn't share that assumption. I did think they would eventually fold, and to be honest, I think in a conventional sense they would have done without the massive material support from the West. I think there would have been some kind of move in that direction, simply because in a couple of months they used all their Soviet artillery ammunition, basically speaking. But I didn't think they would collapse. I didn't think that they were as hopelessly corrupt and riddled with issues. And whereas we can talk about problems within the AFU, I'd be very happy to, as I see them, because that's another thing. I don't like anyone being whitewashed or decisions being whitewashed. They are, frankly, much more competent than I think the analyst class, the DC class, if I can put it this way. You can say the Whitehall class, and much of the media class gave them credit for. And I think Ukrainian society as a whole, as a production of hundreds of years and both of the most recent conflict, has proven to be more resilient than people expected. Now, I know that's not a controversial thing to say now, but if we look back to maybe December 2021, we had a situation where, and going through into February, we had a situation where the vibes, particularly with European states, both European media and European special services, if we want to put them that way, was, this is inevitable, the collapse is going to happen, all of these things. So I take exception with that. Now, I think they've got better, but what I still take exception with is what they are willing to do to achieve their goals. We simply can't apply Western military or Western civil standards, or as in peacetime Western, to a society that is in effect in all-out war. I don't understand why people would, they can't possibly blow up a truck bomb. on a bridge. Why couldn't they? If they didn't do things like that, they would be physically under the boot of a Russian occupation. It's not something which I relish, but guys, stop being surprised. Please stop being surprised. I can't say anything. I'm not fighting for them, but their mindset is obvious, and I think that sort of please understand the mindset. This is not, you and I can talk about this as much as we like, and then go back to our comfy houses and our sofas, right. But I just think that's been a gap.
Yeah, no question. I mean, I couldn't agree more on that. I think there definitely, as we saw, there was plenty of folks that were saying that the capital would fall in 2 weeks. Not only Russian, but American, English, everyone. They were all kind of under that same assumption. There has been an ongoing, and I think it's because 2014, that obviously was very different. That didn't go very well for Ukraine overall. I mean, they obviously fought back, they did a lot, but a lot happened there. But I think the key lesson that Russia didn't apply as well as they did. So the army that we're seeing now is completely different than the one we saw back then. And I think a lot of us assumed it was going to be just like that, and it obviously wasn't. But
I think, to be fair, those members of especially Western military that had actually trained directly with the Ukrainians and had direct contact with them, maybe especially at the higher levels. And I'm not just talking about infantry training. I'm talking about experience with command thinking and some of their planning. I think weren't surprised. I think the issue is that we're talking about a situation where maybe until a couple of weeks into the war, people who were talking about Ukraine, as in news media, were based in Russia. This was the case. And I like journalists. I help as many journalists as I possibly can, because I think accurate information is important. But I think that was a important gap. Yeah, I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I again, like you're saying everything that I've already kind of agree with, and it kind of ties in to some of the narratives that we kept seeing coming out, and that was that what's now become a swear word for me, which is escalation. I'm really, really, really tired of seeing that word, because it just the longer the conflict has gone on, every time escalation is used, it is weakened. And it was the same with Obama's red lines in, was it Libya or Syria?
Syria, yeah.
It was the same with when Obama put out the red lines in there, and nothing happened after. And Russia's been doing the exact same thing.
And it's the same. And funnily enough, the reason nothing happened was because a deal was made via Russia with the Assad regime, and they were very, very scared. Assad and his buddies were very, very scared. They were evacuating. They were going to Lebanon. They were convinced. Now, I think a lot of that is down to the UK House of Commons for giving Obama his excuse, but we don't need to relitigate that. But I think that's an interesting point, because in Syria, and a lot of this was justified, it was easy to have grey zones. I'm not talking about those people, but yeah, it's easy to have, there's bad people on either side. We're not quite sure who we can trust, and we had this whole situation where the Gulf states were involved. We had Russia almost literally dumping its extremists into Syria to get rid of them, like physically, and it was easy to be murky. So I think Ukraine has been a lot easier for media in general to pass, because as much as you want to do verbal gymnastics, NATO expansion, which people try and it usually fails, they invaded. They said repeatedly they would invade. Every single one of their stupid acolytes in the media and their ambassadors and even their foreign ministry said they wouldn't invade. And they invaded, and it was very, very clear who the aggressor was. And you can try as much as you like to say 8 years of bombing in the Donbass, but have you seen Donetsk city? I mean, the Ukrainians get drone footage of it practically every week, just as a reminder of how close they are. And
right.
Yes, not to say there hasn't been civilian casualties. I've done work for human rights related organizations. I've worked with Amnesty, for example, dirty word in Ukraine at the moment. And so the sort of human rights part of me says, every life is precious, and
Of course.
morally so. I 100% agree, but the excuses don't fly. And I think that's been a lot easier for much people. And it's let the average Western civilian, whether it's in Europe or the United States or even elsewhere, fairly easily make up their mind. It's not very hard. Whereas in Syria, as much as, I'm as much of a supporter of liberty for the Syrian people as much as anything else, but the conversation became poison. The situation became poison. It still is. So, yeah, I think that made it a lot easier for them. I do think one of the places where the Western media, but also government is failing is in, I hate the word the global south. I hate using Africa as a continent and saying it's one country. But I do think South America, Africa, India, there's been a gap in messaging on a strategic level. That's not to say that people from these countries all support Russia, but it's allowed that grey zone, like we had in Syria in the West, but there for Ukraine. And I think that's damaging for everyone, really.
So one of the things that you mentioned that was interesting with Obama, you mentioned that the House of Commons kind of gave him either an out, or maybe that wasn't the way you phrased it, but without getting too political, I know we're kind of segueing. I'm just kind of curious what you're referencing there, if you don't mind talking about it.
Yeah, well, I hate to indulge the sense of British exceptionalism that sometimes exists in the worst parts of the internet on either sides of the aisle. But, I mean, sometimes it goes the other way. But, yeah, what I was referring to there was, so obviously David Cameron, along with the French, along with the Americans, wanted to launch a strike against the Assad regime. I can't remember every detail of it, but essentially he put it to a parliamentary vote. And Ed Miliband, who was the then leader of the Labour Party, was mostly expected to support it, as this wasn't a Iraq kind of intervention. But because everyone apparently suffers from terminal Iraq brain, the Labour Party voted against it. And because we weren't going to do it, that was kind of gave Obama, who was never very, very keen on it, in my opinion, the rhetorical, our most senior ally isn't very happy with it. Perhaps we can think of a different path. Perhaps I'm misremembering it, but that was back in 2013. And David Cameron, obviously the leader of the Tory party and the Prime Minister at the time, was furious, but the vote was, it was defeated. So there wasn't much that he could do. They voted against missile strikes basically because of the Labour Party vote against it. It was vetoed, and I think that was one of the first nails in the coffin of, shall we say, international solidarity against the use of chemical weapons.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. And I was in Afghanistan 13 to 14, so if it was around that time, which I believe it was, my memory is bad. I don't remember the details, but no, I appreciate that. I wanted to kind of refresh my own memory, so I appreciate that. So we'll go back. Yeah. We'll take it back to Ukraine again. We kind of alluded to it very really briefly, but beyond the Kiev will fall in 3 days to 2 weeks, what other expectations or assumptions do you think that we in the West are simply applying incorrectly to the war currently? What are some that you've noticed yourself?
Now, this is a difficult one, as I don't like to position myself as a subject matter expert in strategic planning or tactics or anything like this. I don't have experience in that area. But I think some people are almost making the assumption that the war that the Russians are fighting is the same war that the PLA would fight, or the same war that the Iranians would fight. And yeah, I don't want war with either of those states at all myself. But I think in the first sense, people are kind of perhaps fooled by the fact that the PLA has quite a few vestiges of what we could call the Soviet system, Soviet-style aircraft systems. I mean, they've mainly switched to 155 from 152 now, but a lot of this kind of thing. They're not organized in the same way as the Russians. They're learning lessons the same way as everyone else. So I think that's a bad thing to do. And same with the Iranians. I think I hate to say it, but the Iranians have been very successful over the past even 20 years, growing their influence and their ability to apply direct and indirect pressure to the Gulf states, who frankly, without particularly the United States, would be almost defenseless, and also directly to the United States and Western allies. And these are two very, very different, or three very, very different things. I think any layperson can actually see that, but I think there's an obsession maybe with the current thing, the current stuff that's happening. And we did see this, particularly earlier on. I think we've got more balance, but tanks are obsolete, and now aircraft are obsolete, and now attack helicopters are obsolete, and now maybe drones are obsolete because the Bayraktars started getting shot down. And it's like, guys, most of you are trying to be serious analysts. The least you can do, and look, I'm a nobody, but you've got to look at this in the broader context. You've got to look at this from the data points you're looking at. The fact that NLAWs are popping T-72s every single day, this is, let's say this is mid-March last year, that's not that's because the Russians are using them wrong, and not because the entire platform was obsolete. Like, what can do a tank's job better than a tank at the moment? The M10, not a tank, maybe can do it worse. The whatever. So I think that's one of the kind of problems here. There's a lot of lessons to be learned, and I took notice of your conversation you had on this podcast, I think, recently, that there is an awful lot of things to be learned. But I think social media and the massive amount of footage we're seeing can present a skewed view. And I'm cognizant of that. I'm one of the people that behind maybe not the most influential, but one of the most influential conflict tracking teams, whatever you want to call it, regarding Ukraine. And I have to be cognizant of the fact that if I'm writing this, what impression am I giving to the people that are listening to me? Because believe it or not, there's a lot of normal people, that sounds bad, but a lot of average internet users and a lot of nerds and a lot of people that actually are in decision-making places and are policymakers and are all of these things. And I think the social media narrative, tanks are obsolete, or for as an example, it's been dogged on a lot, but it just gives us bad data. And assumptions are made based on that in the future. And we have, like in this country, we've had some senior people in the military kind of make comments that look to me as if you must know better, but it sounds like you're basing that off the fact that you saw a load of videos on Telegram of tanks getting destroyed or aircraft getting shot down and saying, oh, well, bulk is less relevant now. We need automation. And it's like, guys, try harder. I mean, there's people getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to give you analytical information. Please try a bit harder. That's just me. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. 100% right. Welcome. And that's a huge part of U.S. politics right now, too. There's a certain wing of a certain party that harps on things like that. They see, a missile strike in downtown Kiev, and they're saying that the Patriot's a failure and we should stop funding Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. The drill. And that was I think that was honestly half the reason why it's been such a slow drip of equipment over time, is because there's been the expectations and assumptions that this is going to be a failure. This is going to be a failure. They're not going to be smart enough to use that, which is just insulting. But I've heard that multiple times, as if, and I think Liv Faust, who I've done interviewed now twice, he made a good point that if we can teach a damn near 17-year-old kid who just turned 18 how to operate an M1 Abrams, I'm pretty sure that the Ukrainian military, which is now battle hardened, can figure it out. It's not that hard, And I think you even referenced the fact that they've mastered all these complicated, annoyingly complicated Soviet machines for years, and Western equipment's pretty much designed to be relatively easy to operate. I mean, again, enough that an 18-year-old kid can figure it out. Hell, they put me in charge of things, and I still haven't figured out why. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
I'm still trying to figure out why.
It's a good point.
Yeah,
and yeah, you're right. And I think people kind of look at the Afghanistan and the Iraq experience and had applied that to Ukraine. And, I'm not going to relitigate those conflicts. I think two things I would say is, A, the Iraqis probably don't get enough credit, and B, probably neither do the Afghans. It is a fact that their army was built around a certain support infrastructure. And when the rug was pulled out from that support infrastructure, they had massive problems. I'm not going to relitigate any aspect of it, but this much is obvious. And so people have been traumatized by the failure, quote unquote, of these experiences and had applied that going forward and kind of assumed. Now, the very last thing I want to do is say, just because they're from a different background, they're not capable of doing X. I hate that kind of way of thinking. But there have been assumptions made that we're a bit scared of winning. I've seen people say that on the internet, and I take exception to it, because I don't think President Biden sits there thinking he doesn't really want the Ukrainians to win. I think that's nonsensical. But I think had happened, there's been a kind of black cloud over policymaking, which made this assumption that we're going to get outwitted by a more nimble enemy, and we can't possibly win. And I think I have very little positive to say about Boris Johnson, but one of the few things he did do is repeatedly say these people can win over and over and over. And eventually people start going, well, maybe the Russians aren't this special animal which we can't touch. Maybe we can cause real damage to them. I hate to sound cold and clinical here, but that's the fact, in my opinion.
No, yeah, I think 20 years. I think 20 years of coin, counterinsurgency really tweaked our mindset, because we went from Desert Storm, which was, I wouldn't even consider Iraq, even though it was the fifth or sixth largest army in the world at the time. I still wouldn't consider them a near peer. I mean, we had massive advantage over them. We had a huge alliance network. Like, they were never gonna win that conflict. It's just the reality of it. But it does seem like 20 years of coin has almost poisoned some of the mindsets that, like you said, now we're facing what would be considered a near peer. If you want to be super general, let's just go back to February, or let's go back to earlier 2022 and say that Russia's a peer, which I don't think is the case at all, not even close. But let's just say that they are. It does seem like we're so far away from the Cold War, where we were gearing up for peer to peer and we were ready for it. And now that we're tiptoeing back to this Cold War sort of kind of style world that we're living in now, where there's some multipolarity to an extent. I like, me personally, I think that we've made this war go on way longer than it should have. If it had been me, I would have said that, like you said, you kind of hinted at, if you make the costs incalculable for the enemy right up front, it lessens their ability, one, to continue the conflict, but also might alter their decision making. It doesn't seem, I mean, honestly, the way, unless if Russian media is a good marker to tell what their mindset is, I'm not even sure if it would have stopped them if we had wrecked their stuff within the first few weeks. I don't know. They just seem so, I mean, obviously they're in a revisionist period of their history right now. They're trying to, I think they're truly trying to revive the Soviet Empire and all its glory. Big asterisk as far as glory goes for that. A little bit of, I think we just need to take our balls out of our purse, to be honest with you, and accept the fact that we either choose to fight, or we need to accept that we won't have the power we had before. And frankly, we give that up. That's fair to an extent, but who else will pick up the mantle? And the options are bad.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you. And it's a very difficult question. I don't enjoy it when people make assumptions based on Russian media as to their mindset, because different sections of Russian media speak to different people. And frankly, if you're looking at their flagship news programs and their flagship presenters, they're talking to one man, and that's VVP himself. And they're talking to the Tsar, and they have a slant to take. But I don't think we can assume that they're a monolith. And I think this is one of the things that confuses me. If you want to make a coherent policy argument, and some people do, that we should abandon them, and I'm talking about the Ukrainians, and I'm using emotional terms because I am emotionally invested, but we should abandon them. You can make that argument. I might not respect you whatsoever for making it, but you can make it. But what you have to accept is what comes with that. And the United States, I'm talking from a United States perspective here, and as per someone who, and as a country that has benefited fairly massively from a Western-centric viewpoint, is that if you want to hand the reins of international bodies to a foreign power, which some people would seem to be very, very keen to do, you're not going to just then live in splendid isolation. That's not the way it works. They will, and what confuses me is this sort of expectation from some people that, oh, they didn't really want to do this, or they just want to be left alone, and I don't know. There's always varying opinions on this, but no, they do hate you. They don't. None of this is. All of this is cynical. And I was talking to someone the other day, and I was making the point that, in my opinion, I'm not a Russia expert, but in Russia, there's a reason that Putin thinks that the CIA has a PlayStation 3 controller like they had on the submarine controlling Zelensky, because in Russia they don't have the concept of or I should say, in these levels of the Russian state, they don't have the concept of genuine populist or genuine grassroots support. And so when they roll into an occupied town and there's people putting up posters, or they're putting a few rounds into the back of some Russian soldier's head, they'll arrest the mayor and demand that he stops it. And there's this assumption there is always a centralized control. They did this in Georgia as well, and so much of their propaganda actually seems to be through this viewpoint that, no, we really know the truth. That really the masters in DC and in Berlin and in London are really doing this. And there doesn't seem to be an actual understanding that no, that this is real. And I think they get an inkling, and this is why you have these supposedly, I don't read a lot of Russian media, but you get these supposedly sensible Russian papers like Kommersant or whatever, and they'll run articles saying Western commentators are seeing through the fake feeling, and the basis of this will be 3 comments on a Daily Mail article in the UK or whatever in the United States, because the whole point is to show people, look, everything's fake. Nothing's real. Weaponized unreality is the term, and I think it's a good term, that this is all just stage managed, because to a certain degree, that's how it is in Russia, and it has been for a long, long time. No, I don't want to deprive Russians of agency. There's a lot going on there.
Of course.
But that is how it is at the highest echelons of the state. That's the thinking, in my opinion.
Yeah. No, the autonomy thing is definitely a thing, and you're right. I believe I agree with you that their perspective is very different. Like I read an interesting article. The Russian people are used to their media lying to them, and we are too, to an extent, right? I mean, we see things on CNN or BBC. We're like, okay, sure, the truth is somewhere in the middle, but obviously the extent is far different in that country, right? And when I see the arguments, and one of the things that triggers me, I hate to use that term, but it really bothers me, is when they push the narrative that the West is pushing Ukraine to fight to the last Ukrainian. And I've told people this, like I've heard this from Americans, like just down the street, and I told them, like, you can't. Ukraine would not be able to be surviving this long and fighting this long if the people themselves were not in the fight. Like they're not going to the front lines because Biden or anyone else is telling them to. They're not doing that. They're doing it because they want to, and 2, it's an existential threat for them. That whole narrative to me is just the most ridiculous one. And it's insulting. It's implying that they can't think for themselves, they can't operate for themselves. And we've seen that, I think it came out a month or 2 ago, that Ukrainian defense, their intelligence is not telling us everything that they're doing, nor should they, as far as I'm concerned. I think they should be able to run their wars as they see, and as we saw with the intelligence leaks out of the U.S. with that National Guard kid, it's hard to blame them. I think that's 100% fair. But I'm with you, man. They have autonomy. It's pretty clear they do, because if they didn't, this fight would be over already. They wouldn't have their hearts in it, and they very obviously do.
Yeah, I think they're just. it's interesting to me that we've gone quite a long time in the West, quote unquote, and I think Ukraine sees itself as part of the West, so I don't want to malign that. But we've seen
Of
ourselves.
course.
We have no real genuine national threat of the kind which they have in Ukraine, and I've heard it less so in this country. And I think part of that is because we're physically closer and we have. There's Ukraine. I'm not going to say there's Ukrainians everywhere, but there's a lot of Ukrainians here. We see them often. There is somewhat of an unfortunate and fortunate background in this country of people talk about, Battle of Britain, the Blitz spirit, etc. But what the positive thing is that people saw that in Ukraine and have gone and have latched onto it. I haven't seen that dropping off. But we are very lucky where we haven't had that kind of existential threat. And when people say things like that, I think, if they were coming to your house and they were going to destroy your house with a tank, what would you do? Oh, well, I would do something to stop them. And maybe I wouldn't be fighting. I might not be picking up a gun, but I would be doing something to stop them in any way that I can. Well, why do you think Ukrainians are doing that? And I know Americans get a little bit sensitive about this, but it's to be honest, it's the product of being the head of an empire, of being a colonialist mindset. That these people actually they're not really the same people as everyone else because, we have that because we're the imperial masters. And I say that as the full legacy of the British Empire as well. But it is current. The American Empire is lucky. And I think it's just very, very easy for people who perhaps take on the mantle of neutrality to go, oh, well, they're being pushed into it. And it doesn't stand up to reasoning at all. It really doesn't. But it's easy to just think that. And people are uncomfortable. And I think this leads on to the disinformation kind of thing. But people are uncomfortable with things being complicated. They would prefer a grand narrative, and if the grand narrative perhaps is that, well, really Sneaky Joe and Boris Johnson and Macron are forcing the Ukrainians into a fight they didn't want, because that makes me feel better about the fact that actually I'd rather just let them do it, then that's what you'll choose. It's not a difficult concept, really.
Yeah. And you make an interesting point about historically for the U.S., even both world wars, it was a very similar narrative. It was far away. Like we've been geographically blessed to be sandwiched between the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic, and then Canada and Mexico, and in both world wars, those conflicts were very, very far away. And the idea of getting involved in them, and you can see even some old photos of posters from the time, they're very similar narratives. They're very, very close. And like World War I, sometimes I'm still surprised. I'm still surprised that we joined in. I'm glad we did. I think it was the right thing to do to an extent, but that's a whole other thing. But and then World War II, and then World War II, we got dragged in kind of against our will. That we got some heavy motivation there.
I would be the first to credit the United States with that. I think it's an example of how the United States isn't just. It has a lot of the negative characteristics of an empire, absolutely, but it does have, I think, that aspect of it has done genuine good. And this is the issue. You run into this logic, and then you see these absolute morons online, particularly online. In real life, people don't, because if Aaron Marte said, if I'm pronouncing it right, stood up in the street in New York and said the things he'd like to say on the internet, the Ukrainians would punch him, and he would stop. But it's easy. It's easy to say. It's easy to say it here. I say things. Everyone says things on the internet they wouldn't. But you can apply that logic to the Second World, and people start saying, well, actually, maybe it was wrong, and maybe we should have. If Hitler had Europe, he could have come to a deal with the Brits, and maybe we could have partitioned, and maybe that is where the logic leads. But then most people have the conscience to go, perhaps, my logic chain running me to supporting the Nazis taking over Europe is not such a cool thing, and I should rethink my my moral logic here, but
you would
that's
think
just
so.
my opinion. I'm digressing. I'm digressing.
No, honestly, that's like a whole other conversation, man. I could talk all day about, the downfall. That's actually an interesting topic. We could talk about the downfalls of unipolarity, because there are downfalls to that, and some of our worst instincts can come out when we aren't challenged. And anyway, that's a whole other conversation. So I won't go down that path, but I am going to take a note. Yeah, because that would actually be a really interesting chat. So I might take a note for the future. I kind of wanted to move into some of like the disinformation ops. And I know neither of us are experts, so again, I'm just kind of looking for your thoughts and your input. But obviously Russia and China have been notorious for years for operating bot farms, and a lot of people question their existence and whether it's real or fake. I'm not personally entertaining the idea that it's fake. I 100% believe it's real because we've seen them and we've seen evidence of them. But one of the most interesting things that's happened from this war was the rise of like an organic, I'll call it an organization. It's not an organization per se, but like you got NAFO, the North Atlantic Fallout Organization, right? And basically what they've been doing, and I've been obviously I know a ton of them, but they were combating disinformation via memes and shit posting, and obviously very intelligent arguments as well. But as far as I know, there had never been anything remotely like that where these all of our government, both our governments have tried to combat this. I know the military, the U.S. military, operated a Twitter account that was set up to combat disinformation from ISIS and to try to stop recruiting from ISIS, and it was a complete mess. It was horrible. And I think they would admit that. Like they tried to do it through memes, and it was so bad, dude. It was just so bad. I need to write them and see if they'd hire me just to do that, because I feel like I do a better job. But it is interesting though. So you have these people with dog avatars pop up and just completely derail a lot of the information ops coming out of Russia. And I'm just kind of curious, like without diving into too much about either, but what's your take on that? I mean, I just think it's fascinating personally.
Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating. I think, firstly, to say is, a lot of my experience and viewpoint, frankly, comes back to Syria. And one of the things the Syrians never really had, in a large sense, was English language people fighting on their behalf against some of these narratives. Now, I'm not going to take a position on this particular aspect or that particular aspect, but they never had that. So when you have people who, let's be charitable and say, may not be paid agents, but are certainly, let's say, Russian viewpoint enjoyers, putting out this stuff, there wasn't really many people to speak for the people that were getting barrel bombed, or that were getting gassed, or that were getting buried in mass graves. I won't go on about it, but that didn't exist. Now, in Ukraine, it's interesting how NAFO, as it were, it was essentially a Western creation of extremely online people. It's good to see that to some extent Ukrainians have adopted it and taken on parts of it as well. That's great, in my opinion. But also we have this thing where you have what we could call the liberal wine mums. The people that aren't super online, but perhaps don't like what the Russians are doing. And they've sort of taken up with this. And it's not just a group of super online nerds. It's, frankly, because, I'd count myself in that. But it's
me too.
It's normal. It's people that don't spend all their time on the internet. But one thing they do enjoy doing is posting memes and having a little doc and all of these things. Now, look, all power to them. It's a really interesting topic. Now, I would like to say that I know that in like some of the Baltic states, there has been they were doing some of these things before perhaps English-speaking audiences were, and I think some of that comes down to, frankly, superior literacy or media literacy and understanding of what the Russian threat is. But I think it's really interesting, and we had this situation where, for certainly a few months, Russians were or the pro-Russian accounts were trying to do the same thing, and they were making little dog pictures and trying to do the same, but on their side, and it kind of fell flat because you just don't have this critical mass of supporters. All of these things, it comes down to actually what are the IRL effects on it. Now, I don't think we can quantify that, but I do think that what people like NAFO are doing, they are raising millions of dollars overall for Ukrainians, for food, for water, for medical supplies, for drones, for all of these things. And they are acting as a community that can boost those local initiatives. And they're also making it less feasible to perhaps change the area of what is acceptable to say and what is not acceptable to say politically. And if every time you try and introduce the idea that perhaps the Russians were provoked, you have a torrent of people essentially abusing you, it's just less likely to happen. It's fun. You have to laugh. It's funny. It's quite enjoyable. What I think the real world effect has been positive. What I take discomfort in, frankly, is people thinking that, well, because they've got this profile picture and they regard themselves as a certain community, that they're going to go out and actually harass and actually have purity competitions and take joy in human suffering. That's something I'm very uncomfortable with. I've seen massive amounts of graphic imagery over time, and if you are Ukrainian, I cannot blame you for laughing at some of these things. But if you are sitting on your sofa in the West, you maybe should be looking at how am I looking at these things, and is that a healthy way to be looking at life in general? Because it does bleed it over, and you will start having your opinions will perhaps be unhealthy. I'm trying to balance this as much as possible in my language, but I think that the movement as a whole is a very good thing. The only things I am uncomfortable with is perhaps glorying in things which I don't think anyone should be glorying in. Myself, that's my opinion. Believe it or not, I am anti-war. I don't think anyone who's seen it thinks it's a good thing. And I think if you're Ukrainian, you have a license. If you're Syrian, you have license. If you're Georgian, But I think that if you are only very lightly connected to these things, you have to be careful with how your morality is perhaps being modified by groupthink. But yeah, I actually think overall it's a very, very good thing.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. I mean, like my perspective is grim, I suppose. Like I spent time in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. I had different backgrounds or different experiences in all three. Some were like one was a lot less violent and the other one was a little bit more violent. All was smooth, but when I, like me personally, when I see an army like the Russian army, and again, this is just my 2 cents. This is my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not disagreeing at all. But like me personally, I'm probably dead inside. nothing shocks me anymore. But when you see an army like Russia move into Bucha and they move and they do horrible things there, or the POW video where they castrated that one POW, and they do these things that are almost doctrine. I think that it's easy to see why people who are already passionate about Ukraine, defending itself and just seeing that, I get why people why they are glorifying, or I guess why they're celebrating dead conscripts on the front line.
100%. Yeah.
And again, like I'm not saying you're wrong at all. To clarify, you're right. There's a line where sometimes I'm like, I don't know, man. I toe a tough line because some of these guys on the Russian side, they don't want to be there. They're 100% forced to be there. That's the truth. There are some that don't want to be there, and there are some that don't want to be there that will die. That sucks. And then the flip side is there are enough that want to be there and want to do horrible things that their tank blowing up on the front line is a good thing. And I'm glad it's happening from that perspective. Your own way you view the world is tweaked a little bit when you see these things every day. And it's good to be aware of them because, frankly, the world is not a nice place. And God forbid this comes home for you. I imagine, your perspective would be very, very, very different. If it was your family that was in those videos, I imagine your perspective would be very different. So
Yeah.
but again, I'm like in that middle ground. Like I agree with you 100%. We should be extremely careful of how blasé we get about it. There should be empathy for the sake of human life. At the same time, I understand, like you said, like Ukrainians, those in the Baltics whose lives are very much at stake potentially.
Mm.
They have every right to hellfire and brimstone all damn day. And frankly, like I think anyone else, if that's your choice, you do you. That's fine. But I'm with you.
Yeah,
It is it is.
I just would say be aware of how looking at all these things all day, what it will do to your psyche, because you aren't special. You know, some people are special, but you aren't special, and you have. Yeah, the absolute last thing I want to do ever is to tone police the people that are in this conflict. You
Of
know,
course.
but this weirds me out. Now, probably some people are going to hear this and be like, "Oh, this limey is saying this stuff. He doesn't know anything." It's fine. Yeah, who cares? But you have these people saying, "Well, I would have supported Ukraine, but I saw how all these people were celebrating a guy dying, and well, that just morally offended me so much." And these people saying it are supposed to be hardcore goons. They're ready for the civil war. Yeah, whatever. I'm generalizing, but it's like, no, you didn't. No, you didn't. If you were posting hundreds of memes about Boogaloo a couple of years ago,
Oh God!
the concept of people dying doesn't bother you. It's just you're providing yourself an excuse to accept authoritarianism. That's the fact of it. Now, yeah, absolutely. Ukrainians, and look, I think it's really interesting because maybe some Westerners are understanding radicalization doesn't just happen to people who are a different skin color or religion to you. You know, it's not an ISIS thing. It's the fact that you are affected by the things that you see, and that's how you get into a certain mindset. You know, I'm not going to litigate that, but it just astounds me that people sitting on their sofas can so obviously enjoy suffering, and B, it astounds me that people that should know better pretend that it bothers them when it doesn't. I don't think yeah. And the third thing that also blows my mind is that you can't read Russian. Now, I can't say that I'm like a Russian speaker, but you can go on to Russian Telegram. You go onto it's one link click away, and there's hundreds of Russians taking joy in exactly the same way, and Westerners actually, in Ukrainians dying. It's just because the fact it's in English language on a social media website doesn't make you a special snowflake. You're just following different people. It's ridiculous to me. But yeah, that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, NAFO in general, I think it's been a good thing. It's a thing which the Syrians didn't have. And I think they're continuing to do good work. And we saw the same thing with St. Javelin. That's been an amazing thing. I've been really, really heartened by the fact that so many people in Europe and the United States have been so supportive of Ukrainians. You know, the cynical part of me would say it's ethnic compared to some other conflicts. Maybe not. I wouldn't like to put that on anyone personally, but that's just, it's a really complicated topic.
About that. Yeah, we talked about that. We talked about that in the previous episode a little bit, and you're not wrong though. I mean, but there's context. Obviously, it's easier to identify with people who may speak the same language, and frankly, let's be honest, it is easier if they look like you. It is. That's just the reality. It's a normal human thing. That is a bias that is built. I think it's built in. I don't think we can say that doesn't exist because it's not true. I think that every study would tell you that's not true. But I think proximity helped a lot. Again, like a land war in Europe with a nuclear power is a little bit different than a civil war in Libya or Syria. And I think you're right. I think that's why. I think there's just an element of that there, which is a shame because we should have equal empathy for everyone. And I hope that when this war ends, that there's a continued bountiful amount of empathy towards, God forbid, whatever else happens next. And obviously, a lot of people are charged up about China and Taiwan. I don't think that's going to be an issue, but there are hundreds of other smaller conflicts all around the world. There's Wagner and some of those groups in Africa are causing trouble in Sudan, I believe, right? Sudan's where all that stuff was going down recently. I haven't really been keeping track, again, because I'm biased. That's the thing. I get tunnel vision. and I haven't even really been keeping up with Africa, but it's just as important, and that's a problem.
Yeah, and no one's to blame for having limited bandwidth.
Right.
That's no one's fault. But I think the most important thing for anyone is self-awareness of how you're approaching things and being cognizant of that. And I try to be. I fail often, but that's the approach that I take with it. And I just, people say to me, or they send me a message, well, you used to be so unbiased. What happened to the old you? And it's like, well, you just didn't notice because my biases happen to conform with yours. And, I try not to let it enter my analysis.
Right.
But it does. It colors everything. Absolutely. Yeah. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, I appreciate that. Like I said, I'm a fan of NAFO. I'm a fan of what they've done to combat disinformation, mostly because we suck at it from an organizational perspective. So, but yeah, again, agreed. We should keep perspective. That's kind of my final thoughts on that. We'll keep perspective and try to retain our humanity as best we possibly can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even though I feel like it's a losing battle right now. So let's move on then. Your account is heavy on like weaponry and systems and kind of seeing some of the loadouts that we've been seeing running around the battlefield. I don't know, give me kind of your general quote unquote take on things on the ground in Ukraine right now. Is there anything that's sticking out to you? One as a surprise that maybe just you didn't expect lately, or anything that you think that is needed to change the conflict? Kind of give me your big picture perspective.
This is a really, really complicated topic.
Yep.
And the first thing I'd like to say is that I am not an authority. I have instincts which are sometimes correct, sometimes they're wrong. I have identification and monkey brain pattern matching ability, which works well. But yeah, so the first thing is it kind of casts slightly back is that the war that we are seeing in footage is not necessarily the same war that is happening on the ground. Not that it's a different war, but we're seeing different aspects of it. So I am lucky in the sense that I can sometimes benefit from sources which are completely open, and you are aware of things which maybe don't entirely run counter to the prevailing narrative, but they're certainly not the same. And people have this thing where if I don't see it, I can't believe it. I think that's completely legitimate. But there's a lot of things we don't see. And there's also a lot of things we don't see because we are English-speaking people. And you don't have to be so you don't have to be Ukrainian to follow Ukrainian media, and you don't have to be Russian to follow Russian media. Google Translate is like one of the most useful things ever. But there's all sorts of comments and criticism and debates happening on both of those sides, which we don't see. So the reason I'm saying that is because I want to contextualize the things that I'm saying carefully, and I think I would be a lazy analyst, quote unquote, if I wasn't doing that. So yeah, so the situation on the ground in Ukraine right now is obviously it's brutal fighting. It's obviously difficult for everyone. I don't think anyone's going to argue with that. I think that we haven't seen the final evolution of what the Ukrainians are really planning to do in an offensive manner this year by any means. I just struggle to think that, they're going to be attacking in Zaporizhia and they're going to be attacking in Bakhmut and that's going to be that. And as an example, we've seen all this stuff happening over the river in Kherson, which is kind of flying under the radar. But if you're a consumer of Russian channels, then you can see that certainly there's things that are happening there, and Ukrainians are putting a lot of effort in. Let's put it that way. And there are forces that are being moved there, which would indicate they're taking this seriously. Now, when it comes to systems, I think actually it really harks back to one of your previous episodes about the FPV drones. We're just seeing them more and more and more, and we're seeing them on both sides, don't get me wrong, but the Ukrainians are innovating through it. They're extending range or extending capability. They're improving everything about it. And I'm not one of these people that says it's a game changer, and I think we have a danger of learning the last war's lessons by overly focusing on that. But those are becoming more and more important. I think on the Russian side, we've seen the Lancet launching munitions. I don't think anyone could say they're not effective. They have weaknesses. The Ukrainians are taking advantage of those weaknesses. But I think the drones are tremendously important. I think another thing is, speaking as a non-military person, the visual evidence that we have of Ukrainian deep fires is impressive. They're really doing well with that. I think the Russians are defending very, very hard, but they'd be defending even harder if they weren't losing quite so much ammo and artillery and all of this important command and control infrastructure to Excalibur, to Storm Shadow, to other systems which aren't quite so public. So I think that's really important. I think it's a bad idea to focus on one particular weapon systems, but I think the ability to disrupt those really important spots is very significant, if I can put it that way. We've seen really good reporting on this from some parties. Like, we've seen what Rusi did recently about how the Russians have adapted, and I endorse that almost completely wholeheartedly, just from my limited experience. They've been on the ground, and I think we're almost talking about two different strands of the Russian military. One of which is they are a learning organization. They are an improving organization, as much as we would absolutely hate to admit it, and we would wish they never learned anything at all. But they also have this constant problem with getting what's essentially barely trained guys, throwing them into combat, and stupid things happening over and over. And I'm not a tactics guy, but we have seen that over and over, and that is one of the things which the Ukrainians they're certainly having to dig deep. Don't get me wrong, but they still have the initiative, in my opinion, in that area, and I think that's really, really been important. But yeah, no, I'd be interested as to your questions about specific systems and what we've seen and what works and what doesn't work, and I can just give you my opinion from my experience and my viewpoints.
Yeah, no,
anything particular?
for sure. Yeah, no, I mean, God, that's another thing I could talk all day about. But real quick, you're right about the learning. Like, it is silly to think that neither side is learning lessons, which I think I mentioned in the last episode I did too. But I was shocked though, because last year I remember seeing, and I think I said something about it on Twitter, but I saw a Russian soldier that he had died, and his tourniquet was zip tied to his chest.
Yeah,
and I was like, wait, what? Why would you do that? Like, that's insane. That's ridiculous. And then this past week, I saw it again. He was alive, but his tourniquet, actually no, he may have been dead, but his tourniquet was zip tied to his chest again. And I was like, that is like, I cannot fathom. Well, I can fathom. Let's just be real. But like, from a U.S. Forces perspective, that is something that is just like, that is a squad level task. That is something that your squad leader walks you through, checks your kit, make sure you're squared away, make sure everything is there. Like, that is something that just shocked me. And then we saw another video of a tank. It looked like a T-72 or something, just roll over 8 to 10 anti-tank mines that were kind of in the middle of the road, kind of open, bluntly open, and they just kind of rolled over them. And like, yeah, and like that itself, someone made a good point that like the visibility may have been severely restricted because they were under attack by drones. So maybe they had the hatches back. Whatever. I don't know. I wasn't in that tank, so I can't speak. But what did stand out was what happened after, when that most of the crew survived. Lucky for them, they got out and they just kind of ambled around. They didn't try to secure anything from the tank. It didn't look like. They just kind of walked around it, sat with their hands on their hips, and just stared at it for a while. And like that, that's like a small indicator of the level of training for me, because if I was their platoon leader or commander, we have certain TTPs and things that we need to follow when you're under fire, and standing around the object, in this case a tank that just got hit by mines that is now a sitting target, is usually frowned upon. There's learning, but at the same time, I don't think that they have the intellectual infrastructure at this time to truly learn in a way that's going to affect them from like a tactical level, because they don't operate NCOs the way the UK or the US or French or German military does. They don't have those low level decision makers that win wars. I mean, officers like myself a lot of us will talk all day long about how great officers are, but let's be real, the NCOs are going to win the wars. And it's just until they change that, they're never going to be on par. They never will be. They can throw bodies at the wall they want. That's my take. But the Storm Shadow, what do you know about the Storm Shadow? I mean, it seems to be doing fantastic work, and I wish they'd had it a year ago. But everything that I'm seeing shows it doing the Lord's work, so to speak.
Oh, I mean, I would say that literally, physically. I think that it's obviously a very, very capable system. I think that online we disparage sometimes Western weapon systems because, put it diplomatically, we don't hype them maybe in the same way that the Russians are very, very good at doing. And it's obviously a very, very effective system. And the thing that blows my mind is that this thing was being developed in the 90s, and its heritage goes back before that. This is not, this is sort of the iPhone 5, to put it in that sense. It is not super new technology. There's replacements being developed literally as we speak, and that it's a very good system. I honestly don't have much else to say about it. They're using it in the right way. They, as far as I can see, interception rate is apparently very low, and I think it just shows that we tend to disparage Western technology because perhaps we have this. It's a good thing. We have ideas going back and forth about what's a good thing and what's a bad thing, and perhaps we think our systems can be a little more effective than we give ourselves credit for. The other thing is it.
Go ahead, sorry. No, as I said, we also have the freedom to critique versus, we don't hear critique out of Russia or China for their weapon systems per se. So, yeah, and had we earlier, we would have known the T-14 was a bust and that the SE-57, they could only make less than 20 of them in the time that we made 300 some F-35s. So, there's probably an element of that too. Anyway, go ahead.
I mean, look, it's a good system. I have absolutely zero doubt it's having a real impact on the battlefield. I would like to give credit to the men and women who put months of work into making it work from an Su-24. I think I am absolutely fascinated to read the book or the blog posts or whatever comes out after this finishes about how they do some of this integration work, because it makes the sort of nerd within me extremely excited. But
me too.
Yeah, so I think credit to them, and I think credit to the Ukrainians for using it effectively, and I think also credit, frankly, to the decision makers on this side of the Atlantic that said, "Okay, we're going to push the button and we're going to move ahead with this." And the way that it was framed, I appreciated. It was like they're launching cruise missiles against Ukrainian targets every single, let's not every single day anymore, but every single week. It's not an escalation to give them the same thing, and we're not giving them Tomahawks. We don't have 1,000-kilometer range systems there. I mean, I think they should have Tomahawks, if you ask me. But we're not we're not doing anything special. We're not giving them technology which the Russians would never ever had eyes on. I mean, this thing has been a primarily export system for 20 years. So I think, it's obviously very, very effective. I think some of this talk about ATACMS is perhaps premature. We'll wait and see on that one. But I think that we just have seen, if you give them the tools, they will use them.
Right. You use them very well.
It's as simple as that. I would like to touch on it at some point. There has been plenty of deficiencies within the AFU, which I'm not pointing out, but Ukrainians are pointing out themselves. But in this particular case, I think the Ukrainian Air Force has been doing a heroic job of a very, very, very difficult situation. And I think people, perhaps Wunderwaffen is made too much of, but if we do get to the stage where the F-16s are in combat and they are operating, that's going to be another step change in capability. And look, I think we should have given them Storm Shadows a long time ago, but I do appreciate the technical and the political restrictions and constraints that we have to deal with. But I think the Storm Shadow has been very, very, very effective. I think the Excalibur has been very, very effective. The bonus round 155, I think there's very, very few systems which the West has given to the Ukrainians which they haven't been able to use effectively. But
yeah, no, I agree. I was surprised. It seems like because I don't know much about the Storm Shadow. I know its basic details. I was surprised that the they don't seem to be doing very well intercepting. The interception rate seems really poor, and that kind of surprised me. Not that it should be easy, but I think we severely overestimated some of the Russian AA capabilities. That seems to be a lesson learned from the last year. Not that they're not formidable, but I don't know, man. They don't seem to be doing that great altogether, stopping some of the West's most advanced weaponry.
Yeah, I mean, I think their GBAD organization have been overestimated, and we know that this stuff can work very well. I mean, the Ukrainians have used 1980s systems to great effect over time, and I think one of the things which Ukrainian Air Force pilots have said is, I'm not an aviation guy, but the danger is not from their ground-based air defenses; it's actually from Russian Air Force fighter jets with the R-37. I can't remember exactly, but with their very long-range missiles. And we know there's been more than one kill of Ukrainian Air Force jets using that system. And it frankly boggles my mind that we are so far into this invasion and the Ukrainians are still operating, they're still running air support, they're still doing missions, and the Russians are just struggling so hard. And I think maybe some of that is to do with the fact that they don't want to lose their assets. Because we saw, I mean, I'm making an assumption here because perhaps I'm wrong, but the Ukrainians moved to Patriot PAC-2 battery fairly close to the border not so long ago. And you had 4 aircraft down in a day. And I might be wrong, but I'd like to think a Western Air Force would be perhaps cognizant enough of the dangers that they're facing that this could happen, that they wouldn't be encountering quite such terrible issues. And it's interesting because I think that's a problem with how the command structure works. Because when we can touch on Wagner if you'd like, but we saw the Wagner columns move towards Moscow. They had modern air defense. They had some not so modern air defense. And guess what? They worked extremely effectively. So
yep.
I don't mostly think it's a equipment restriction limitation.
Right. Yeah. You made a good point about the kind of going back to our assumptions and expectations when it comes to Ukraine's ongoing counteroffensive down south and near Bakhmut, and where a lot of folks were expecting this to be this rapid Desert Storm style offensive, and I having trouble wrapping my head on how anyone could think that, because we together, UK, the US, and every other ally that we had an astounding overmatch of air superiority over Iraq. And Ukraine doesn't have that. In fact, neither side has air superiority, but they're still launching an offensive against layered defenses, which is one of the most difficult tasks, if not the most difficult, besides maybe an amphibious landing, that you can do as a military force. And they're making progress. I mean, they are, but the expectations beyond that were way, way too unrealistic. And again, some politicians that belong to a certain wing of a certain party keep bringing that up as a reason to stop funding. And again, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how war actually works. We were spoiled by our success in Desert Storm, and there's a trap we're falling into where we think every conflict's going to be just like that, and the reality is it's not. God forbid, knock on wood, it never happens. But if we were in a war with Russia right now in some country, and it would be different. I'm not saying we would. I still am very confident in our chances, but it would not be the same at all. It would be significantly difficult.
Yeah, and it's sort of, that's the kind of mindset that you get from seeing a recruiting ad, which has hyper masculine guys doing stupid things, and that they're just going to beat us. I don't think we have to worry about those people in the
Sure.
sort of genuine analytical sense. It's just stupid, low information way of thinking. But yeah, I mean, it is really interesting, at least to me, that I'm not going to say blame here, but there has Ukrainian messaging before the offensive to some degree did allow for this thunder run, Kharkiv style blaze through kind of viewpoint, and I think there is some evidence to some degree that particularly the 47th Brigade, they perhaps expected to do something a bit closer to that in the first couple of days of the war. It didn't work out. I'm not criticising anyone for that at this point. So, and I'm not a strategic analyst, so I really don't think it's my place to do that. But at the same time, to anyone that is informed unless you are talking in bad faith. This is not a failed offensive. They are not used up. There's not thousands of them dying in one spot, and we have seen over and over and over the Ukrainians are much better at medical care. They're much better at staying with their men. They are much more cognizant of human life where they can be. This doesn't apply universally, but
Sure.
I just think we've got to have nuance here, and I think people kind of see that and go, "Oh, well, you're just coping because they didn't do this or they didn't do that." And it's like, look, in 3 weeks or 3 to 4 weeks, they've taken more land than the Russians did in 6 months. Now, you can argue about the significance of that land, and you could say, well, it's less significant, fine. But you can't then turn around and say this is the world's most terrible failed offensive.
Exactly.
Because you touch on a good point that the Russian engineering corps overall, they are good at what they do. They're doing. The Soviets were not bad at engineering either, as far as my understanding reaches, and they're doing what the Soviets do or did, and the trenches are effective. And anyone realistically expecting the kind of sprint through, what are you smoking? And that includes that includes, to be clear, listening to people from the Ukrainian side, from the AFU, from their intelligence services, from the defense ministry. That includes that. You need to be skeptical of all of it, and look at what they've got to run into. And I have an awful lot of respect for the men that are running up against that hour after hour, day after day. And I do think we're going to see a situation where they make more gains. But exactly what that looks like and where that is a different kettle of fish, as it were. But I think what we can be assured is that the systems which the West have given, or in some cases sold to the Ukrainians to do that, it works. It's effective the great bulk of the time. There's very, very few systems which the Ukrainians are saying, "Oh, this doesn't." And we even had these situations where you've got ex-British Army, Mastiffs or Wolfhounds or whatever, essentially mine-protected vehicles that are meant for rolling through Basra in 2006, performing actually very well against a high-intensity conflict, against tank shells, against artillery. So I think actually we shouldn't be down on ourselves. What I do think we should be down on ourselves for, and I include particularly the UK in this, but a lot of other places, is bulk. I think one of the things in terms of weaponry is the levels of usage of artillery ammunition and of small arms ammunition, and all of these systems is incredibly, incredibly high to anyone that can see it. And the Russians, to be clear, have massive, massive problems in that regard as well. But where is our investment for it? Because maybe the war ends soon. I hope it does. But if there is ever a conflict against China, do you think that somehow they would have less capability than the Russians to produce ammunition?
Right.
Like, we need to get serious now, and I think a lot of countries are getting serious. I don't think we are properly. I think there's a lot to be done there, but that's just my opinion. That I don't think you need to be an expert to say they're using so much ammunition, they're using so many missiles, and this is just going to be the case if there's ever a huge conflict like this. And we saw it in Libya, where NATO allies were running out of ammunition, just bombing the Gaddafi's army. I think that should have been a wake-up call, but perhaps not.
Yeah. No, you know how that goes. It takes a lot longer for wake-up calls to actually happen.
And it takes a lot of people to die as well, apparently.
Yeah, unfortunately. There was some speculation that if it was the US and the UK in Ukraine's shoes right now, we would have burnt through most of our stocks even faster, because we tend to be a little bit more liberal with how we use our ammunition. But I've seen some moves back in the States, at least. I know even here in Pennsylvania, they started back up this factory that used to produce artillery shells, and they're starting to increase capacity. I don't remember the quote, and I don't even recall. I'll have to look it up, and maybe I can post it separately when I share the episode. But there at least is a narrative that is there, and it seems like the Pentagon is taking it extremely seriously, because I've seen a lot of communications from a supply perspective about we need to seriously we need to take a step back and look at our production capability, especially for artillery and missiles, because it's going to be a problem if we really want to play ball. And like you said, we shouldn't assume that China has any lack. We shouldn't assume that they can't manufacture their own. And we also shouldn't assume that anything that ever happened in the future is going to be quick, because as we've seen, it almost never works out that way. I mean, very few wars are short. Again, we're spoiled by Desert Storm. That's a problem. We're spoiled by Iraq in 2003, and because it was an overwhelming success in the early months. We just can't operate like that anymore, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, and look, people tend to miss this, but in the first couple of months of the war, there's many things that saved Kiev, but one of the most important things was artillery. And modern, drones spotted artillery, but everyone was, I say everyone, but a lot of people were dooming about the mysterious convoy which never got there. Part of the reason it never got there was because they've got awful logistics and all of these things. But another reason was the Ukrainians were using an awful lot of munitions to stop them. Like the reason they needed M777s or they needed all of these other Western systems in 155 is because the Soviet stocks were running very, very low, and their own production is increasing, and European production is increasing, and American production is increasing. All of these things are great, and that's what we need. But people do tend to forget that at the very beginning, it wasn't just all the Russian planning problems and their assumptions. It was the fact that the Ukrainians did have some stocks of heavy munitions they could apply liberally for quite a long time, and they used it effectively, and we've seen the result. I think one of the things that I think Faust has said over and over is the Russian military of 2 years ago or a year and a half ago simply it's never going to be back in any sense. So in that sense, the damage is already done, but there's a lot of future threats to think about, and it is important to consider that hopefully on Ukraine weapons tracker, we will be doing more on this soon. But the Russians have stepped up production in a big way. They have increased production. Their artillery production has majorly increased. Their anti-tank guided missile production has increased. Their small arms ammunition has increased. So I say this as a person that is a non-expert. I don't think we can complacent in any way.
Right. And I've seen some images popped up over the last few days of Chinese artillery shells being used by the Russian forces. So they've obviously, we knew that was going to happen. I don't know if it's in any significant number. I don't know, but we can expect that will continue. Again, the best solution right now is my opinion, is an aggressive, violent victory that truly makes the war just unsustainable anymore for Russia. And that could still take some time, but I think what they're doing, and I think what they're doing is right. I think they saw that just going back to the offensive thing, I think they saw that it was going to be more difficult in that specific area than they were hoping, and that's fine. That's how that works. They adjusted. It seems now that they're okay with a slower, more cautious pace, which I am too, because again, it saves lives. And their counter battery for taking out artillery, AA, and even EW systems seems to be the way that they want to degrade the capabilities and just continue to weaken the South over time. I think they can do that because, like you said, you go on the Russian Telegram, it's not good news on their telegrams. It's not. There's not a lot of optimism right now, nor should there be, frankly. But even with I saw your thing about the Bradley, the Bradley vehicles getting a little bit of a cult status because those few were lost in that first push, and of course the propaganda channels jumped on that as if it was some aberration or it was strange. But very few that I saw these catastrophic Bradley failures. A lot of crew survival in almost every video I've seen, which is great. That's what they're designed for. There are thousands of Bradleys out there. If it lets that crew live a little bit longer and they also tear some people up with the autocannon in the meantime, that's great, So I don't want them to do. I wouldn't want them to do human wave tactics like Wagner did in Bakhmut. We don't want that. We want them to sustain their fighting power for longer, and that's the way to do it. Just be a little bit more cautious. It takes time, but it's a trade-off.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, I think actually there are outstanding concerns about how long the support from the West lasts. So I'm not going to touch on that too much. And they're legitimate, but at the moment, the Russian leadership, if I can put it that way, believes they can withstand this, but at the same and outlast it. But at the same time, look at what they thought they could do in February 2022, and look what happened after that. I don't think we need to have any. I don't think we need to rely on exactly what they're thinking. I do think that people sometimes forget that they are not operating on the same value system as perhaps in the West we are, and perhaps the concept of the value of lives is perhaps a very different thing for them. But yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting few weeks and months, and I really think this is not the last front for everyone to be worrying about. That's just my opinion. We've seen enough signals and enough perhaps lack of signals and enough units which aren't in places where you perhaps expect them to be, that perhaps there's more coming. That's just my opinion. But when it comes to the weapon systems, I think we should just, if anyone says the tank's obsolete, they should be quiet. If anyone thinks that drones are obsolete, they should be quiet. I think almost we're talking about a story of both a World War One attritional trench warfare and a lot of these modern advancements on top of that are frankly just making the whole process more intense rather than becoming a huge game changer. We can say that the HIMARS was a game changer to the degree that all the logistics were getting disrupted, but we saw adaptation. And I have no doubt that there'll be adaptation to Storm Shadow and there will be adaptation to all sorts of things. But I just think it's still going to be, that's my opinion, it's going to be grinding, it's going to be brutal, clearly, utmost respect to the guys that are there. But I don't think that the prevailing narrative of what's happening in one spot in the south is something that we should be listening to. I don't think it's smart, but that's my take.
Sure, yeah, you want to stay a little objective as best you can. You want to just, like you said, just look at the reality on the ground. Take a balanced view as best you can, and just don't make assumptions. I think making wrong assumptions just puts you in hot water half the time. And you're right. Well, so that's kind of what I had for you question wise. I guess my last parting shot would be: is there anything that you currently are working on that you're kind of passionate about, or just anything you want to, like, last little word you want to bring attention to before we wrap up for today?
Yeah, well, I'm always trying to be as accurate and interesting as possible with the material that I put out there. I hope that there's going to be some more substantial reporting, if I can put it like that, of some of the less covered aspects of what's happening in Ukraine. We are hopefully working, so no guarantees at all, working on some writing regarding the reactivation of Ukrainian Air Force equipment during the war and how they are using donated Eastern Bloc pattern aircraft. In that regard, we are working on what we could call the mobilization models of Ukrainian armoured vehicle refurbishment production, because there has been quite a lot of that, and people have talked lots about the new up-armoured Russian tanks and slightly less about what the Ukrainians are doing. We are trying to learn more about what the Iranians have been producing for both sides. It's definitely on both sides. So there's all sorts of really, really interesting things there, but it's just the case, frankly, of finding the time. But despite what a lot of people think, I'm not paid for almost anything of this. Most things 99% of what you see in public of anything that I've written is completely free of charge. It's completely paid for by me. And I do it because I want people to hopefully have accurate information that I can put out there. That's the goal. So yeah, absolutely. If you'd like to support what we're doing, there's coffee links on my profile. It's right there. But to be honest, you should be donating to the people that are under fire, not to me. I am lucky, but I really do hope that in the future I can continue providing relevant information.
Yeah, no, that's great, man. I've been following your account for a while. I've followed UA Weapons for a while, which is the Ukraine weapons tracker. I've been following that for a hot minute now, and a lot of fantastic information from both. So I do appreciate your efforts just to get that info out there, because it's typically really, really balanced. It's just, here are the facts. There's no spin to it. I really appreciate that, because I try to maintain that as best I can. Now, granted, my account's a little more of the shit post variety, so sometimes I don't I do some effort posting, but I appreciate you guys. So, just as a quick reminder for anyone who's listening and wants to follow Cali or the UA Weapons page, if for some reason you're not, Cali's page on Twitter is Calibre Obscura, and then there's at UA Weapons. And then for the website, it's calibreobscura.com or uaweapons.com. You can check out any of those, and I highly recommend you follow all of them, because they're really good. With that, man, that's all I had for today. I really appreciate your time. This was a really interesting chat, so I'm appreciative of you joining in.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's been interesting. I would just like to note it's not just me that works on UA Weapons. We have, there's two of us, and we are privileged to try and perhaps not be the fastest out there, but to try and put out as much accurate information as we can, including some sourcing from things you don't just see pulled off Telegram. There is some unique stuff there, so I would encourage people to check that out, and I would also encourage people to donate to either buy stuff from St. Javelin, donate to Come Back Alive, donate to credible Ukrainian charities or Syrian charities if you can, because remember there was earthquakes a few months ago, and there's still thousands and thousands of people in Idlib who both enjoy Russian artillery and living in terrible conditions. So if you could think about those people rather than me, I'd appreciate that.
No, that's great. That's really good. And just to throw that out there, Armory Bazaar is the at for your partner in the UA Weapons. So give him a follow, him or her a follow as well. I just realized I wasn't, so I just did that. So I'll make sure.
He doesn't say much. He's the silent one.
Yeah, there always has to be one, right? A type A and a type B. But that's great, man. Well, again, thank you for joining. I'm sure I'm going to be circling around with you soon. Maybe we'll talk about something a little bit different. Maybe we can fine tune some new topics. But in the interim, again, your time is greatly appreciated, and we'll be in touch soon. Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.